Hello, this is Andy Mahoney. I'm with the Center for Identity Potential. I'm here today with my colleague at the center, Kristin Cotts, and our guest who we are doing a series of interviews with, the renowned Dr. Adele Green, a neuropsychologist from the Washington, D.C. area that we have worked with for many, many years. And she does incredible work that speaks for itself if you ever used it. And if you're not familiar with her work, you really should consider working with her, because there's probably no other neuropsych tester that we know of that is as comprehensive and as thorough and produces an incredible report that is beneficial for a client for many years on. And as a clinician, we really appreciate what she gives us because we integrate it in our work. So what we're going to talk about today is her background and understanding and work with language processing disorders. So she's going to give us a very robust description around the purposes and what's involved and what can be done. So today's interview is really the beginning of the process of learning about language processing disorders, because there's so much to know. So we will do subsequently other interviews with Dr. Green and explore further more of the interventions, both that she does and that we do to work with children, adults, and particularly gifted and talented children from our practice, because that is our specialization. So, Kristin, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can start asking Dr. Green to say a little bit about her background, and then why is, your first question. So let's go from there.
Okay. So, well, the first thing I was going to ask is why it's important to learn about language processing disorder to begin with.
Well, we all want our children to feel good about themselves, and feeling good about themselves, a lot of it is related to school, a major part of their lives. And so if you have a really bright kid who seems to be doing well, and then suddenly they start struggling, there must be a reason. Sometimes they can struggle in different ways. They can struggle academically, they can struggle socially, they can struggle emotionally. Emotionally, they become more difficult at home. These are warning signs, these are red flags that something's going on that really began long ago before you were even aware of it. And that's what the language processing is all about, and why it's important to know this, because it's important for parents to be knowledgeable and educated about warning signs that can trigger these problems that occur later on. There are children, of course, who are distressed from the very beginning, and they have these developmental challenges, even if they're highly gifted, it doesn't matter. They have these developmental challenges, and these also may impact on their ability to process language. So circumstances, regardless of how gifted a child is, the circumstances determine whether they're going to struggle or whether they have problems that suddenly arise or have been there all along. And a lot of this has to do with language. It's the core way we communicate. It's the way we can succeed in school. And most people don't realize the importance of it. And so that's what I want to educate the audience about.
And how did you come to know so much about language processing disorder?
That's a good question. I'm not a language pathologist, but I have extensive experience in teaching and creating programs. For example, years ago, I created the second dialect program in an inner city school. I've written textbooks one on English as a second language, one on cross-cultural communication. This is years ago. My dissertation and research was really on how language is processed in the brain of those learning Spanish as a second language. And to do this study, I actually researched many different areas of beginning people who are just beginners and people who are proficient in reading and music and chess and all these different areas. And the difference in the way language is processed. Recently, in fact, my research, I used a non-invasive method to detect this, and my research was replicated by PET scan studies later on. And then recently, in the past year, a group from Sweden was doing a meta-analysis and found my my dissertation work, I had 2 or 3 articles from it. So interesting that they wanted details that were not in the articles, and they used it and thanked me for it in their meta-analysis. And that's very recently, in the past year. So it's still relevant about language processing. The term language processing is relatively new, but I've been involved with this and talking about this for many years.
So why don't you talk a little bit about the process? So how we actually learn to process spoken language.
So we learn to, there's a process that goes on in how we learn to process language. There are certain, and I'm going to talk about them. I'm going to talk about how we learn to process it, and if you want to know the cognitive functions that are involved. And there are certain circumstances or developmental factors that can slow language processing that we may not be aware of. I had one recently that they weren't aware of. He's now 22, and they realized that there was a factor there, that there was a warning sign there, and this just, and highly gifted. I mean, the IQ is more than, it was 3 standard deviations above average. And the warning signs were there, but nobody knew, and he was masking it all these years. And because he's so gifted, he could mask it completely, but at the cost of eventually depression, major depressive disorder, anxiety disorder, and also struggling and not being able to work consistently and procrastinating. So these are warning signs that are important. I'll also be talking about not only the developmental factors that can slow language or circumstances, but I'll be talking about how slowness to process language causes students to struggle in school, and then how these struggles can be seen as behavioral problems. And then I'll talk about strategies that some students use to kind of offset these problem processing language, because they're not aware of it. Typically, when they're gifted, as the one I saw recently, he wasn't even aware that the strategies that he was using were not typical. He just thought, well, that's just the way it is. I mean, he wasn't aware of it. He knew he was doing it, but he just thought that's the way it is. And I want to alert the audience to what these kind of strategies are. And then, so there's some strategies used, and then I'm going to talk about some adaptive strategies that can be used to process language more efficiently. Of course, therapy is generally very important because all of these problems create a lot of anxiety. When you mask a language processing disorder, it creates a lot of anxiety, and you need therapy too, concurrent with certain kinds of treatment.
Okay, so how does it all start? How do we as humans start to learn to process language?
Yeah, so when very young, we have to have the repeated exposure, hearing language. We have to have the repeated experience to hearing the sounds that people talking to us. That helps us to attach meaning to new words and phrases, and in time, sentences. I mean, this is true of even, by the way, birds. Everybody needs a period of repeated exposure. Even creatures need a period of repeated exposure. And it's critical that they have this. If they're not available for it, that's a problem. And some kids, some infants who have a lot of distress are not emotionally available necessarily, and they fall behind because the first year of life is critical. But anyway, we need this period of repeated exposure, and there has to be a period where you don't make any you need a silent period to be able to learn the meaning of words that we hear and sentences that we hear and put them together. And if we don't have that silent period, then there's a problem. Even deaf children need a silent period. They don't sign their first sign till 5 or 6 months of age. They're listening all that time. And hearing children, they need more than 5 or 6 months because the vocal apparatus in the throat is not sufficiently developed for them to really express themselves. So you need a silent period, and children who come to the United States usually go through a silent period before they start speaking. And adults would actually be more efficient if they learn a second language, if they had a silent period too, and then started speaking, because otherwise you're dividing your attention between understanding the language and processing the language. And that can be a burden for a lot of people. If you just focus on understanding the language and its meaning, you'll do much better in speaking the language when it comes time to speak it. So this is a natural thing that occurs. So we also need, when we get enough experience, then we need to see similarities and differences between objects or whatever we see in our world. And we need to see how things are different. In the beginning, kids think that infants think are babies, all four-legged creatures are dogs, but then they get to see the similarities and the differences between dogs and other four-legged creatures. So that's very important. It's a part of the process of learning to process language, to organize and integrate it and understand what they hear. And once they learn to see similarities and differences, they learn to categorize it. We have to learn to categorize information. It makes our thinking more efficient. So we learn to categorize things in terms of, we say, their colors or their numbers. That's all categorization, and that's very important. Once we learn to categorize information, we actually learn rules. And that's, the rules are important. Like we learn rules for language, and we learn rules for math, column addition, etc. And when we've mastered rules, we are better able to follow directions. But to be able to master rules, in the process, you're picking up the grammatical structure of English. The grammatical structure of English is important. It's actually set in the first year of life. And there are infants who are so emotionally distressed for whatever reason. It could be the environment, or it could be just gastrointestinal problems, or whatever it is, that they're not actually as available as other infants for getting that grammatical structure. And that comes out later on. So when you master the rules, of course, if you're really good, especially if you're bright, then or you're gifted, you're going to differentiate quite young the meaning of the past perfect or the conditional perfect. For example, he would have been able to win had he not broken his leg. Now, I mean, quite young. You're already in school. You're not in preschool or anything like that. Then, of course, sufficient skill in processing language, that helps us to conceptualize information and retain information. And this is a problem. If you don't have sufficient skill, you're not going to be able to conceptualize it and retain it. Or if you're slow, if something is in the way and makes you too slow to process, organize, and integrate the language, you won't be able to conceptualize it. And we see a lot of kids who, they're very gifted, but they can't conceptualize things right away. Most of all, and most important, conceptualization is important, but invariably, I find that no matter how gifted they are, if they haven't learned to organize and integrate language quickly, or they aren't able to organize and integrate language quickly, then they don't automatically evaluate what they hear. You have to be well grounded in the material to evaluate what you hear. And if you don't have that grounding in grammar or whatever it is, or the subject, or if you're not able to organize and integrate the information quickly, then you won't be able to evaluate it. So that's the basic process of how we learn. And what other questions do you have?
Well, maybe you could talk a little bit about cognitive functions that are involved.
Sure, yeah. So the functions that are involved in processing language are attention. You have to pay attention. If you don't pay attention, then you're going to miss things. What if you have fluctuations in attention? Well, you're going to miss things. So fluctuations in attention can cause people to miss words. What about working memory? Well, you need to be able to hold the information in your mind in order to organize it and integrate it into some kind of gestalt or big picture. So the working memory is very important. And then, of course, as I mentioned, you need to organize the information. You need to put it together in a logical order so that the parts relate to the whole. Another factor that's extremely important that most people aren't aware of, maybe many psychologists, is auditory discrimination. This is the ability to detect small differences between sounds, called phonemes technically. This is critical. More people, many people don't seem to be aware of it. The case I had a few weeks ago, it was a young man who, he had some very minor articulation problems, and they knew he couldn't discriminate between R and T. And he had a couple of sessions of language therapy, speech therapy, but then that's all. Well, actually, he mishears much of what is said. He mishears it. And when I gave him just a screening test, he was so profoundly impaired. And he just can't discriminate between the sounds. I gave him 2 words and he had to tell me whether they're the same or different. And he just bombed it. But it's consistent with because he is quite precocious. He, even though he's 22, he's highly gifted verbally, but it doesn't matter. He's struggling, and he's been struggling in different ways. And I'll talk about some of those ways people struggle. So,
Can I ask a question?
yeah.
And maybe you're going to get to this, but can you talk a little bit about how the discrimination problem and the processing of information affects your ability to retrieve information from memory and therefore utilize your working memory?
Okay. You utilize your working memory. Well, your working memory enables you to keep it in mind so that you can form a gestalt. And if you form a gestalt, then you can retrieve it. It's going to be hard to retrieve without forming a gestalt. Now,
well, hold on a second, because you just kind of reversed it on me. So I want to go back.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, good. Because this is a part where I find in my work that it's critical that people understand the first part of what you're talking about is how they code information, how they process the information into memory.
Right.
What we see a lot of is that people have enormous problems with retrieval, which affects their ability to use their working memory. And I'd like you to highlight that for me, because that in the practical clinical sense is where we make the most gains with people, when we can teach them the process of how they process information effectively affects their retrieval process, which then affects their ability for output.
Yes, of course. Right. So when you talk about, so what happens is that in the process of learning, you have to use working memory. That helps you to form a gestalt, okay?
Right.
Now, if you're too slow, Andy, to be able to process it, you're not going to be effective in getting a whole, complete conceptualized idea. And if you don't get that, then of course you're going to have trouble with retrieval. So it's not so much working memory, it's a consequence of insufficient conceptualization to begin with, because one of the factors that I talked about, whether it was attention or working memory or whatever, caused you to be slow, or auditory discrimination.
Well, this is why I interrupted, because I don't want people to think it's about working memory so much.
No.
It's really about the precursors to the process of utilizing working memory.
That's right.
Yeah, and a lot of times you'll test people and I'll see that they have good working memory, but poor processing. And they get confused because they think, well, my working memory is good. Why can't it work?
That's right. So if you have a problem with auditory discrimination, then it's going to slow your ability to organize and integrate the information. So if you're slow to organize and integrate it, you're not going to be able to conceptualize it. But that's all because you have problems discriminating between sounds. Now we have something called attention in our brain. And if much of our attention is allocated or used just by making sense of what you hear, because you can't discriminate between the sounds, and so you have to either make predictions or figure out what it is that's said, you don't have the attention left to even conceptualize it and evaluate it. Does that make
total sense? And I know I'm jumping ahead, but can you link that? You can talk more about this later if time allows. If not, we'll go into another discussion. But can you talk about how that that struggle translates into hypervigilance?
Yes. Okay. Very good. So, yeah, I'm not sure I'd talk about it later, but it does. When you have to exert or use or consume so much in the way of attentional resources just to process, organize, and integrate the information because you're weak in one of the factors, say auditory discrimination. So if you're using so much attention doing that, that is going to, the only way you can do it is to be hypervigilant. You have to really, really hear and listen hard. And that hypervigilance, by the way, and sometimes like the one I saw that I talked about, the 22-year-old, 23, I forget, he was not just hypervigilance, he was like hyperarousal state of mind. And so he was highly anxious because that creates a lot of anxiety. And not surprisingly, he has trouble falling asleep, you know, because you can't shut it off at night. It doesn't just turn off. If you're hypervigilant all day, it doesn't shut off at night. Although some students are so exhausted at the end of the day and they just fall asleep and their day's over.
Yeah, and I think at some point we should have a discussion further about the long-term effects of hypervigilance in a human's life.
Yeah.
Because we oftentimes get young adults and adult clients who are brilliant, who've been dealing with hypervigilance from language processing disorders throughout their life. And
Well, that's right.
There's an enormous amount of compounded effects over time that we have to unravel and then help people develop other ways to accommodate and to work through those issues.
Well, that's right. So you really, I think therapy is critical because you have to reduce the anxiety that all these maladaptive strategies that people use that they're not even aware of necessarily, or they think it's typical, it's not typical. You have to be able to make up for these, you know, you have to have therapy to help you reduce that anxiety and all the other effects, the emotional effects that occur as a result of that hypervigilance.
And our belief is you have to, when you're providing therapy like that, you have to have a foundation and knowledge in these issues or it's not effective.
Well, that's another problem, Andy. I'm not sure many.
Well, we won't go there right now.
No.
We're here to educate people about why it's important, right? So I didn't mean to take you too far off, but I like the way you filled that in for us.
That might be a good segue to talk about how weaknesses in processing can be viewed as behavioral problems in school.
Sure.
Which is, as a parent, that's a really important question.
Well, first how they can be viewed, but do you want to know the factors that
Sure.
Yeah. I'm going to tell you about the factors that can create or cause you to be slow to organize and integrate language. One we talked about was the auditory discrimination, and that's very important. But there's other warning signs like sometimes hypotonia, which is low muscle tone. That can cause the child to have trouble clearly articulating all the words. And not articulating all the words for whatever reason, it can cause faulty feedback to the brain about how the words sound. And when that occurs, not only does it compromise your ability to, or slow your ability to process language accurately and discriminate sounds within words, but it eventually affects reading as well when you start reading. So it can actually interfere with reading comprehension. Another warning sign is frequent ear infections. I see kids with, or adults or whatever they are, they have a history. I have one coming up, history of a lot of ear infections and fluid in the ear. That scars ear tissue. And that impairs the perception of sound as it comes into the ear, and which is really acoustical signals, but that's beside the point. So that frequent ear infections or fluid in the ear, that's a real problem. Another one is heightened. Some people have heightened sensitivity to sound. I don't know if you're aware of that or not, but some people can't stand loud noise or noisy environment. They just can't deal with it. Now, what happens is that the brain is, normally it just, in all of us or in most of us, it just efficiently screens sound for relevance, so we're not even aware of it. But in someone who is heightened, who's exceptional sensitivity to sound, then the brain is not able to, the brain has to make an effort, and that takes attention to screen the sound for relevance. Now, that takes attentional resources that could be used to make sense of what you hear. So it really interferes with the processing problem. I told you articulation is a real trigger for giving faulty feedback to the brain and causing problems processing language. Exposure to two phonetic languages, when there are weaknesses in attention, working memory, organization, or auditory processing, and I should add insufficient exposure to the processes needed for language, that exposure to two phonetic languages can cause problems. On the other hand, I have to tell you that if you can have exposure to two phonetic languages, and if you don't have weaknesses, these kids they tend to really excel. They tend to be higher in cognitive measures, in measures of creativity. And there's a lot of research to show that. But these are usually middle-class kids who don't have any problems in these areas. But if you have these problems in these areas, it can really mess things up. So now to get back to your question about how slowness to process language can cause students to struggle in school, right?
And behave and be misread or misunderstood as having behavioral problems.
That's right. That's right. This is very common. First of all, let me tell you how it causes students to struggle in school. They have trouble keeping up. If you can't keep up and fully understand what you hear in class, you're going to get overloaded. Well, if you get overloaded, then you're going to lose it. You're not going to be able to keep up. It's going to be a problem. So that's one problem. They have trouble keeping up. Another problem is that because they're so slow, they have trouble fully grasping how the big picture, and this is a big important part, they have trouble grasping how the big picture relates to its parts. So this is really important. If someone, for example, doesn't see the big picture, like even in, often kids don't do this, they have trouble mastering mathematical concepts such as fractions, or they don't see the big picture, and that is the relationship between fractions, percent, decimals, and whole numbers, unless the teacher teaches it. But kids often miss that. So that's now where we're talking about trouble keeping up. And you want to know how it can cause students to struggle in school. So if you can't keep up, of course, then what are you going to do? Right? What are you going to do? You misbehave, you distract others. Especially, I have to tell you, most kids who are gifted have high expectations, and they have high expectations for themselves because our definition of self relies on our strengths often. The middle class, but generally the definition of self is high, really feeds into high expectations. Now, if you have high expectations, and if you're also sensitive to embarrassment, then you don't want anybody to know that you have weaknesses, because after all, you're smart. Mm-hmm. People don't have weaknesses, right? smart people are fast. That's the myth. And that's to what they adhere. So they have a lot of trouble in terms of keeping up and causing problems in the classroom because they can't sustain attention. So, you know, this gives the impression that they are deliberately fooling around. They're deliberately distracting others in class. Oh, they're so social. And that's often viewed as school as behavioral problems.
I want to add to that because there's another direction that occurs there where there's a withdrawal behavior for some, where they don't create a behavioral disturbance, but they're not expressive. They pull back. They don't engage.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Withdrawal is also, especially social withdrawal, because it's so effortful, because they are sensitive to embarrassment, because they don't want anybody to know they're so ashamed that they can't process or express themselves well. So it's too risky for others to find out that they're not as good or not as bright as they're supposed to be. So they just socially withdraw. And that's very, very common in what occurs with slowness to organize and integrate language. You know, some tend to be so embarrassed in that others might see how stupid they are. They hold in their frustration and then they unleash it onto their family at home, you know. And then the school's so surprised to find out they're irritable at home and completely wiped out at the end of the day.
And tired from the hypervigilance.
And tired, exhausted, right. But some just keep going. They're on overdrive. I see a lot of people with language processing problems that they're on overdrive 100% of the time.
Yes, and our culture kind of rewards that, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's true. You're right.
You know, my saying, you know, we used to treat neurosis. Today it's a commodity. So,
yeah, that's right. That's right. So, you know, there are situations where they act out in school, but they're fine at home. They let it all out in the school. And there are also situations where everything's fine. They can take care of it at school and at home, but they have a lot of somatic difficulties, you know, complaints, headaches, stomach aches, and that's how it's displaced. In my experience, they also have trouble initiating and completing work, they procrastinate, etc.
well, you know, the other thing I want to add to there is they have a lot of struggle with people making judgment over their language ability and their writing ability.
Oh,
so
yeah.
When they mispronounce words because phonetically they don't hear it correctly, or they've not learned, or they have trouble with retrieval in terms of, you know, they're like caught like a deer in the headlights. Those kind of symptomatic things that occur affect the person's ability to participate or want to continue, and then how they perceive themselves. So we see a lot of, you see this with adults too, where they may mispronounce something, and then in a public setting, they're corrected for their mispronunciation, which, by the way, in terms of etiquette, that's one of the most inappropriate things to do to someone in terms of etiquette, but people do it all the time. And so then it sets off a whole process of shame and doubt and questioning of self, that I'm not smart, or I'm not worthy, or, you know, this person sees me as ignorant just because I'm not able to articulate myself in the manner at which they feel is appropriate. And that is an enormous problem for a lot of the clients.
Right. Yeah. If you have enough of that criticism, again, at the very beginning, I said, we all want our kids to feel good about themselves. And I've seen too many gifted kids who think they're very inadequate and they have very low self-esteem. And it's all part of it. And
could you address that in terms of how this affects reasoning? Because what we see is, under certain contexts, bright, talented, brilliant people can use their reasoning in certain areas very effectively. But when it comes to their vulnerabilities in areas where they're not so strong because of these issues, they tend to misuse their reasoning and how they evaluate the self. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit, anything you can say about how this all affects a person's reasoning ability.
Okay, so they tend to misuse their reasoning, to me, they tend to misinterpret what they hear because they're so used to making predictions and jumping to conclusions that they do that even sometimes when they don't have they're not rooted in a strong body of information. And so in doing that, they make mistakes. This affects, now you asked how that affects them in terms of emotionally. Is that what you asked?
Well, I was talking about well, I know in a sense the effect emotionally, but I just wanted to help people understand a little more about how the problem with language and auditory processing affects your reasoning ability, how you use reasoning, what it does
Okay.
to your ability when it
Okay.
comes to reasoning.
So if you're relaxed, it's different. If you usually when you're grounded in knowledge, then you know you don't have any problem having it affect your reasoning. It's when you are anxious, and in school with a language processing disorder, you're going to be anxious, you're less able to use your reasoning ability, partly though because you don't have all the information and you haven't fully conceptualized it so that you can't evaluate it, and you're not used to evaluating it because all your attention is used to just processing the information. That's when it's novel. But there's a difference when you're well grounded in it. So I think that, and also the fact of mishearing things, mishearing information and mishearing words. If you're always making predictions about what you're hearing, and nobody knows about it, of course, if you're sensitive to embarrassment, you're not going to be able to conceptualize it well if you're mishearing words, because so much attention is used just trying to piece it all together. So you're gonna misinterpret it.
Right. And I want to add to that in terms of that problem, because of course we're talking a lot about learning in school, but the implications of that problem affects adults in terms of marriage, relationship problems.
Of course.
It's a much bigger problem than most like marriage counselors would understand, or
Right.
couples would understand, that
Right.
there's these processing issues, these language processing issues are detrimental to a healthy relationship.
Absolutely.
And a lot of times effective marriage counseling is when you train people in essence to listen better.
Yes, very good.
So,
Very good.
but they don't make the association between the clients that are coming in for marriage counseling. Typically, in my experience as a marriage counselor for 37 years, really is rooted back in their inability to process, and then it gets emotional, and that
right.
floods the, the amygdala gets overwhelmed, and then the processing goes way
right.
down, and then we have to really sort through the baggage, and they tend to put too much of it on the psychological aspects of it as opposed to the neurological developmental problem.
That's really fantastic, Andy. That's very good. I don't deal with marriage. I'm not a therapist.
Lucky you.
Well, I have no intentions of being a therapist. I like what I do. Just the evaluations.
That's just one example of a major impact, and it can, and I'm not even talking about the workplace or how you deal with your children or how you communicate under difficult situations when you have to advocate as a parent and you're under enormous
Yes.
stress,
Oh.
or when you're dealing with a doctor or something with your child.
Yes.
I mean, and let alone a
Right.
school system who really doesn't have this knowledge, and they don't
know.
understand the relationship between what they're seeing as a behavioral problem is really rooted in a learning or developmental problem.
Right.
Yes.
The social,
Go ahead, Kristin.
I was going to say the social implications of it too, because if your reasoning is not working right, you're going to evaluate yourself in relationship to other people and what they think of you and what they're saying and how they're interpreting it incorrectly. And so I think a lot of times, especially in the schools, we look at the social issue like, oh, they just have poor social skills, or they don't have social empathy, or whatever that might be, rather than looking at the actual communication issues.
Yes.
And not only making it difficult to
yeah.
communicate, but causing faulty reasoning in terms of how where they fit in the whole scheme of things.
Right.
Right.
So being slow to process language also can affect your inability or your trouble assuming the perspective of others. Again,
Correct.
and that, of course, has to do with marriage as well. So again, if you're all consumed with just processing what you're hearing, you're not going to be able, you don't have the attention left to assume the perspective of others. And that's a problem.
Correct. And that just compounds. I mean, that gets very difficult. I would like you to address one issue we see a lot with parents when they come to understand their child. They will oftentimes say, well, how can they have a problem with that? Because in other areas, they're doing that exceptionally well. And we have to go through an enormous process of education and helping them understand how that plays out in a pragmatic sense. Can you address that issue?
So when you're interested in something or you have a knowledge base, actually you're highly motivated and the brain automatically organizes the information. So it speeds up the whole process and it allows you to bypass some of those weaknesses because it's enabling you to see the gestalt of what's being said. So it makes it much easier. That's true for reading too, by the way, Andy, that if you can have all kinds of weaknesses, you can be dyslexic. But if you're really interested in something, then, and you want to read it, you're going to read it, and the brain is automatically, and I've had this proven to us by language pathologists in the past, but the brain automatically organizes it. You're reading in a different way than someone who is bogged down by weaknesses in the mechanical aspects of reading. So it works the same way, so to speak. So that's why people can organize and integrate information very quickly when they're interested, when they have a body of knowledge, or when they have keen interest, or for whatever reason, but they've got a definite motivation to learn that information. They're going to be able to do it. That's not the case in most areas in school anyway, and maybe in life, but in learning. One other thing I want to tell you that people do is that some people do you ever know people who just dominate the conversation and they don't let you speak? I mean, by dominating the conversation, if you have trouble processing language, by dominating the conversation, what you're really doing is that you're preventing someone to know that you have trouble processing the language and you can keep up. Or people I see, they tell me, oh, their kids play with much younger children. Why? They play with much younger children because they can keep up. And they're not embarrassed. They're able to keep up with doing it. So the strategies, what are the—
Well, let's do this.
Yeah.
Because this is a lot to take in, and I really would like to do a separate interview with you on strategy.
Oh, okay.
I really believe wholeheartedly that when people when you hit the nail on the head with information and you're creating awareness of the problem at this depth, that people automatically start to insight and use their working memory to develop strategy. So I really would like this interview to kind of, wrap around what we've been talking about. And we can do another interview, which I'd be glad to do, about strategy. I did want to mention when you talked at when you were talking about the dominating of the conversation and how people interact, as you know, I teach people how to throw dinner parties, right? And one of my side tricks. But what's interesting is I teach them about the process. And when you have a table set where everything is precise, everyone has an equitable share of the table, and you've created an environment that is comfortable, you adjust for sound, you adjust for visuals, you adjust for functionality, right? So what happens then is that people's ability to process communication, even if they have a vulnerability, goes way up. So that's why at a good dinner party, you'll see an effective group process if it's facilitated, because the container is designed to heighten processing in an effective way. And most people don't understand that. But if you go to a dinner party where the table is set poorly, there's too much noise, there's chaos, the visuals aren't there, it's going to be a very chaotic experience. And, for some people it might lead to indigestion.
Sure.
They just don't want to come back again. But that's just one example of how you can accommodate for processing. And we do a lot of things in our culture to accommodate for processing issues. And then so when we get into, intervention, we can talk more in that regard. But I thought that was, that came
That's
to
very
me
interesting.
as you were exploring how people listen and how people dominate in the conversation.
Yes.
So before we go, Kristin, is there anything in particular you'd like to wrap with in terms of a question or a comment?
I'm processing all that information.
It's a lot, isn't it? I love it.
I don't have much in terms of adaptive strategies, so.
Well, we do in a sense, but what we want to do, we want to eventually talk to you about that, because you bring us the knowledge, the expertise, and the foundation of what we need to educate people in terms of why we do what we do.
Okay.
I think your explanation of auditory discrimination, the connection to reasoning, and the impact that has on so many other things is gold. And I know as a parent, I would love for the teachers in the school and the people to hear that, because I think it unlocks so much in terms of what's really going on. And for whatever reason, it's not something that's taught, in education classes, and whatnot. So
Can I just make a point about that?
Mm-hmm.
Schools generally adhere to the typical audiological evaluation. Typical audiological evaluation requires someone to be 2 standard deviations below average in order to have a problem. You're going to gift a child and you're 2 standard deviations below average. Even if you're a little above 2 standard, you're a little less than 2 standard, you're still, you don't have a problem. So that's a problem by itself. Generally, according to my information, they do not account for corrected responses or time response lags. And kids who are gifted, or people who are gifted, are so fast that the audiologist may not realize that it is a response lag. They may not realize what self-corrections mean. So that's the problem with a typical audiological evaluation. I can talk about it in another conference about the kind of audiological evaluation that I like.
Yeah, that's what I'd like to get into in our next discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, it's wonderful being with you.
Oh, same here.
And so we're just going to wrap here. And Kristin, you want to say anything before we go?
thank you, Dr. Green.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And
I want more people to know about this, and
We're going to do our best to share this audio video.
I want the schools to know about this. They're totally unaware. They seem to be totally unaware of this.
Well, we're going to help with that. So we're going to have to say goodbye now.
Okay.
thank
All
you
right,
so
great.
much.
It's
Bye.
great.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.